Well, hundreds of demonstrators and police have clashed in Shanghai as protests over China's COVID-0 restrictions flared for a third day and spread to several cities. The wave of protests is unprecedented in mainland China in the past decade. Joining me now live is former DFAT Australia-China Council scholar Andrew Phelan. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. How significant are these protests?
They're profoundly significant, Danica. Good morning to you. We've not seen such protests since Tiananmen in 1989. My first trip to China was '88. I was back as an undergraduate scholar in 1990, and the difference in those 2 years was huge. I can scarcely believe what I'm seeing on TV, given the security and surveillance apparatus in China. For people to come out on the streets and be yelling, "Da Dao Xi Jinping," down with Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping Shatai, Xi Jinping stand down, I can scarcely believe what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and it's just extraordinary, the vision that we have seen as well. Realistically, how big of a difference are these protests likely to make?
Time will tell. It's hard to say. They're certainly being recognised, and they'll have the leadership extremely concerned and thinking about what to do. But, you know, the question is, I guess, how did we get here? If you compare across the strait with Taiwan, at the time of the outbreak of the pandemic, Taiwan's vice president fortuitously happened to have a degree in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins. And they had eyes and ears on the outbreak of the pandemic right from the get-go. The difference between the mainland and Taiwan is that Taiwan has used Western vaccines. Xi Jinping has put himself in a corner by a combination of using domestic vaccines, which have been found to be less efficacious than Western ones, and using the crude tool of a lockdown. Now, as you know, he's just been confirmed for another 5-year, possibly even 10-year term in the party congress that concluded in October. And this policy is Xi Jinping is the architect, and everybody knows it. Now, there's a few things that have brought this to boiling point. One of them was a fire in a building in Xinjiang, and there was a 3-year-old that died in that blaze, who's scarcely been outside for the entirety of the pandemic. And if you think about the impact this has had on young people in Australia, multiply that by a factor of several in terms of the length of time people have been locked down, the life that they've missed out. And now people have seen Xi Jinping at the recent summit season in Southeast Asia and his wife not wearing masks. And then they've turned on their TVs and watched the World Cup and seen all these fans from around the world having a great time and not wearing masks. And they're asking themselves, what's going on? Have we been hoodwinked? Has our leadership been bolting our doors and locking up? And where is this heading? And then underlying that, there's this, I think, universal human appeal for freedom and space and democracy. And the Chinese people are no different to us in having those aspirations.
No, of course. I mean, they just want to live their lives, I'm sure, once again, like the rest of the world. What does this mean for China and its relationship with Australia? Are there any global implications from this?
Well, if you 30 plus years ago after the Tiananmen massacre, Bob Hawke made a speech, a tearful speech. There were protests outside all the diplomatic missions in Australia. People were yelling and screaming, down with Deng Xiaoping, down with Li Peng back in the day. So far, the response from Western leaders appears to be muted. And this is because of course, of China's power and strength and the importance of its economy today, which dwarfs the Chinese economy of 1989. So it's going to be very interesting to see what our leadership, Penny Wong in particular, Anthony Albanese, have to say. I think they'll be very cautious in what they have to say. But, I think it's time that the Western and international leaders recognise this regime under Xi Jinping for what it is and started being a little bit more, despite talk in the media of a so-called reset, the underlying factors that make the Chinese government what it is today have not changed, and the underlying conflict remains. Look, I fear for what might happen in the next few days. China has an enormous surveillance and security apparatus, and demonstrations are not unusual in China. It's just that these spot fires that usually happen over real estate and financial and land issues tend to be put out very quickly. China spends more on its domestic security than it does on defence. It's extremely well resourced and equipped, the Public Security Bureau, the People's Armed Police. And we've seen some acts of brutality meted out on poor innocent civilians that have been protesting. So, I worry about this. I have great fears because I don't see that a face-saving way for Xi Jinping to change policy and back down.
A precarious situation. Andrew Phelan, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Danica.